Welcome back to the show, everyone. I'm Joe Concha, filling in for Steve Malzberg on this Wednesday afternoon. Kicking off the third hour of this show is another Malzberg panel. Joining me this time, investigative reporter for the American Media Institute, an author and former legal affairs writer and Supreme Court correspondent, what a title, for the New York Times, Stuart Taylor, Jr., and clinical professor of law and director of Securities Law Clinic at Cornell University Law School, William Jacobson. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me on this Wednesday afternoon. Appreciate it.
Great to be here.
Sure. So why don't you fill us in on what we're talking about today, and that is Scott Walker, Wisconsin governor, obviously a union buster, elected to do so, obviously a potential presidential candidate in 2016. He has been, in some circles, called targeted by a district attorney in Wisconsin. That gentleman's wife may be involved in making this personal. Instead of me trying to explain it, you both have been following it pretty extensively. So I'll start with you, Mr. Taylor. If you could fill in the blanks for our audience at home exactly what the situation is in Wisconsin and what it means, certainly would appreciate that.
District Attorney John Chisholm, an elected Democrat of Milwaukee, has been investigating, and now has other prosecutors involved in it, has been investigating now Governor Walker, who became governor in 2011, since he was county executive of Milwaukee in 2010. The investigation has gone on and on. It has been enlarged numerous times, dozens of times. And in a lawsuit that's now in federal court, I gather the plaintiffs just had a setback on appeal. Eric O'Keefe, head of the Wisconsin Club for Growth, and the club, which are conservative groups, claim that the entire investigation is an effort unconstitutionally to harass and silence conservative speakers throughout the state by falsely alleging that they're violating campaign funding restrictions against what's called illegal coordination of their campaign funding with now Governor Walker. This has been fought up and down in both state and federal court. It's still being fought up and down in both state and federal court. The whistleblower, which I broke in a story I wrote about the entire investigation, has now been identified as Michael Lutz, and he's a former decorated police officer who for a few months was a district attorney, a special prosecutor, I think they called him, in Mr. Chisholm's office, who was very close personally to Mr. Chisholm by his account, and nobody's contradicted it, reported to me that at 2011, when the entire state was in a huge partisan brawl about Walker's union curbing reforms, the DA Chisholm said to my source, Lutz, that his wife was very distraught about, because she was a teachers union representative for the union, and she was very distraught about Walker, very bitter at Walker, was in tears repeatedly, and that in connection with that and in the same conversation, Walker told Lutz, A, that he had to stay away from Republicans. A Republican-elect judge was seeking some help from Lutz. B, that he wanted the Republican-elected judge to lose the election, because he wanted the state Supreme Court to strike down Walker's reforms. And C, that Chisholm, the district attorney, felt he had a personal obligation to stop Walker. Those are the words, personal obligation to stop Walker from treating people like this. That's where things stand. Now, both the DA Walker and the local newspaper, which has covered itself with shame in this matter, in my opinion, and frankly, I don't think it has to be an opinion. I think it jumps off the page if you look at how they've covered it, has smeared Mike Lutz, my source, outed him, exposed him to retaliation, and has falsely alleged that he threatened the governor. He threatened Chisholm. He made a death threat against Chisholm and his family, which is a ludicrous charge and a libelous charge.
William Jacobson of the Securities Law Clinic at Cornell University Law School. You've written about this extensively as well. What can you add to what Mr. Taylor has told us, with is both shocking and disturbing?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that people have found hard to understand is why John Chisholm has gone after Scott Walker with the vigor that he has gone after Walker on what at best is a tenuous claim that coordination on issues between conservative activists and the governor's campaign somehow violates the law. Now, two judges, a state court judge and a federal district court judge, found that that did not violate the law. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, literally within the last hour, came down with a decision which basically said it's a matter for the state courts to decide, that the U.S. Supreme Court law is not crystal clear on whether so-called issue advocacy can even be regulated. So the Seventh Circuit sent it back down to the state courts, but the state court judge has ruled that even if everything John Chisholm says Walker and the conservatives did, they actually did, it wouldn't be a violation of Wisconsin law. And even if it were a violation of Wisconsin law, that law would be invalid. So what you have is a very curious situation. And I think Stuart's reporting and this whistleblower really sheds light on what potentially is the answer to the question everybody has had for months and months, if not years, which is why are they going after Scott Walker on a questionable legal basis? And I think perhaps we now know the answer.
Well, Scott Walker, certainly if he were to enter the presidential race in 2016, you would think would be at the top of the list. There is no clear front runner right now. You could talk about Ted Cruz, you could talk about Rand Paul, and Chris Christie obviously seems to have a second life after an NBC report here in New York said that federal prosecutors couldn't find any connection with any bridge closings at the George Washington Bridge, which was supposed to be, I don't know what he was going to resign on, or at least certainly couldn't run for president as a result of. And then, of course, we hear about Rick Perry and Jeb Bush. So perhaps there's a larger issue here that, you know, Democrats, obviously there was another runoff election that happened in Wisconsin that Mr. Walker won again. So he's basically been elected governor twice there. And I think the biggest threat, at least according to the Milwaukee Sentinel, was that President Walker in the White House would be a severe threat to any unions, obviously not just in Wisconsin, but across the country as well. And perhaps they see the bigger picture here, and perhaps that's why he's become the target that he has. Mr. Taylor, any credence to what I just said?
You know, the union thing is interesting. He clearly busted the public employee unions in Wisconsin. Now, there are a lot of people who think unions are fine in the private sector, let's share the profits, so you speak, who oppose it in the public sector. It's not just all unions. He didn't go after any private unions. And I'm not sure he ever would go after any private unions. His view, and the view of a lot of people, I'm told, including George Meany, the first head of the AFL-CIO, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, opposed public employee unions because they didn't think the same people who work for the government ought to be pushing the taxpayers to pay them more, at least not in the unionized form. So I think it's probably fair to say that that Walker will carry his opposition to public employee unions wherever he goes. There are lots of Democrats who aren't so keen on public employee unions. There are lots of education experts who think the teachers' unions have ruined our schools. So I'm not sure that's going to be a clean partisan divide.
William Jacobson, how do you think all this shakes out now that, you know, we do have whistleblowers coming forward, that this is getting more media attention? Obviously, Scott Walker, as I mentioned, could be going for national office come 2016. We only have about 45 seconds, but how do you think this all ends up a month, 2 months, 3 months from now, now that all this is out in the open?
Well, the real vice of this whole John Doe procedure and the way it's been handled by the prosecution is that it has become an electoral issue. Scott Walker is in a very tight race. Whether you like him or you don't like him, this has been a cloud hanging over him. And at least if, you know, this whistleblower is correct, it's not by chance that this is a political vendetta against Scott Walker based on his union activities and the collective bargaining law. And we saw how crazy people were. They took over the State House. They were attacking people. So there has been a vendetta against Scott Walker. I think what we need to find out is whether this John Doe procedure is part of that vendetta. And I hope we find that out before the election.
Oh, very good, gentlemen. We appreciate you joining us this afternoon. Certainly some great work there by both of you in getting this story out, and some good old-fashioned journalism. We don't see that very often anymore. Thank you. Up next, Steve Malzberg, speaks to the president of Judicial Watch, Tom Fitton. A fascinating conversation. Stick around. It's the Steve Malzberg Show. Joe Concha filling in on this Wednesday afternoon in New York.